I'd had it up to my eyeballs in that moment. A steamy August afternoon with the cicadas wailing in the distance, when I watched Karen from the HOA slip past my no trespassing sign and into my yard for the fourth time that week. To be clear, I had posted signs, installed cameras, and even confronted her politely in the past. Every attempt to keep her out of my personal space had failed, and now she was skulking around my hydrangeas, not even pretending she had a right to be there. My frustration sizzled under the scorching sun. I was convinced that if I caught her just one more time, I might do something I'd regret. Let's just say I'd never been known as a mild-tempered person. My property sits at the end of a cul-de-sac in a long-established neighborhood full of retirees and middle-aged couples. It was quiet when I first moved in, gorgeous old oak trees, wide sidewalks, and well-kept lawns. Exactly what I thought I wanted after years of living in cramped apartments. But within 6 months of signing the deed, the HOA board decided to bring in improvements. And so began the slow, creeping authoritarian vibe that turned this quaint suburban refuge into an Orwellian watchtower. Karen was the board's new self-appointed compliance officer, a title she'd given herself with the same flourish a knight might have upon receiving a sword from the queen. Actually, it was more of a whisper around the block. Nobody else wanted that duty. She took it upon herself to ensure that every mailbox was a regulation 4 feet from a curb, that the exact brand of mulch was spread in the front yards, and that God help you if your grass reached half an inch taller than the recommended 2-inch length. I'm not a rebel by nature, but I'm also not someone who likes being micromanaged in my own home. I'd grown tomatoes in half barrels out back for years, something I loved, and I had plenty of legitimate reasons for wanting my privacy. Sometimes, if the mood struck me, I'd grill a steak, toss a baseball to my nephew when he visited, and forget about the world. But Karen's prying eyes were always there, peeking through the fence slats, taking pictures with her phone, or scribbling notes on a little pad. The day she first barged into my yard like she owned it, I was sipping iced tea in the shade of a hickory tree. She marched right past a private property sign, grabbed one of my tomato plants by the leaves, and started tisking about it, leaning too close to the fence. My blood boiled. I politely asked her to leave, but she just pointed to a line in the HOA's notoriously dense rulebook, which I honestly hadn't read from cover to cover. Something about vegetation encroaching on the boundary. She was in the wrong, obviously, but Karen was the type who'd recite half an obscure bylaw to appear more official than she was. So we had a heated exchange. I told her to get off my land, and she puffed up like a blowfish, flinging threats about fines and formal complaints. That was the day I realized I was dealing with the kind of busybody who believed herself unstoppable. My annoyance only deepened over time. She began patrolling. Once, I found her leaning over my fence at sunrise, snapping photos of my yard furniture. Another time, I discovered footprints in the soft soil near my back porch. Karen's sneakers, same pattern and size, clear as day. I asked her politely again to leave me in peace. She wouldn't. What baffled me most was her intense obsession with my property line. My fence was legitimate. The boundary had been surveyed before I moved in, and my landscaping was hardly an eyesore. Yet that didn't stop her from constantly criticizing, walking around my yard uninvited, or threatening to report me for the most minor details, like a mismatched paint color on the shed door. Eventually, I fought back with official letters, citations of my own, referencing state trespassing laws. I even got a lawyer friend to draft a stern notice for her. Karen responded by lodging a complaint to the HOA about lack of neighborly cooperation. This was absurd, especially given her intrusive behavior. Despite my best efforts, I kept seeing that short, determined figure trotting across my lawn like it was her personal thoroughfare. She'd circle the rose bushes, jot something in her notebook, and vanish. If my front curtains parted, she'd scurry away like she'd seen a ghost, only to pop up again when I least expected it. I'm no stranger to conflict resolution, but it became clear reason alone wouldn't deter her. I had a short fuse, always have, and she was lighting it daily. My paternal grandfather used to say, "Some folks need a stronger lesson than words can teach." For him, that might have been a stern handshake or a phone call to the police. But Karen had escalated well beyond courtesy calls. I needed something more creative, something that would keep her away without me having to resort to lawsuits or fistfights. And that's how I began contemplating booby traps. Not lethal, of course, but something that would embarrass her enough and punish her sense of entitlement to keep her off my property for good. Would it be a fence that zapped her with a mild electric shock? Maybe a sudden blast of water from a hidden sprinkler? I spent nights lying awake, brainstorming, smiling as each new ridiculous idea popped into my head. But it wasn't until I recalled a hilarious memory from my childhood in the countryside that I struck gold. Skunk spray. You don't forget the pungent stench of a startled skunk. I remember, as a 9-year-old, my older cousin dared me to sneak up on a skunk in the barn. I foolishly tried, and suffered the immediate consequences. My clothes and hair smelled for a week, and even after multiple baths in tomato juice, the essence lingered. It was an unforgettable lesson in boundaries. That recollection sparked a downright mischievous plan. If a determined, self-righteous HOA zealot was going to keep marching in my yard, she'd have to pay a stinky toll. Not actual skunks, of course. I'm not some monster who would capture wild animals and set them loose, but a synthetic skunk essence that would replicate that unmistakable odor. I wanted something potent enough that it wouldn't wash off with a quick rinse. It turns out you could buy skunk essence online if you look in the right places: farm stores, certain hunting supply shops. That's precisely what I did one weekend after scanning through product reviews. I found a brand guaranteed to clear your nostrils and cling to clothing. Perfect. I stocked up, tucking the small vials in my garage, awaiting the right moment. Still, I didn't intend to just fling it on her. That would likely open me up to assault charges, or at least some kind of lawsuit. Instead, I needed to ensure that if Karen trespassed again, she would trigger a device that sprayed a controlled mist onto her shoes and pant legs. Harmless, but unforgettable. I spent a few late nights rummaging through old junk in my workshop, rigging up a motion-activated contraption reminiscent of a Rube Goldberg machine, except simpler. I wanted to hide it under a decorative lawn gnome or some such yard ornament. The idea was that the device would sense her presence when she crossed a certain line in my yard. At that moment, it would release a discreet puff of skunk essence. She'd be none the wiser until the smell hit her. I even tested it a few times on an old pair of jeans draped over a chair. The stench clung for 3 days. But I knew I needed to be meticulous. If it misfired while my mailman came up the walkway, I'd be doomed to more trouble. So I pinpointed a spot she always invaded, near a cluster of shrubs along the fence she claimed was overgrown. I installed the device there, hooking it up to a small battery and a motion sensor that was angled so it wouldn't catch the neighbors walking on the sidewalk. I spent a day carefully calibrating the sensor range and adjusting for wind direction. The final step was to fill the pressurized chamber with the pungent fluid. I wore a mask and gloves just to avoid any unfortunate accidents. With that done, I felt a rush of childlike excitement, tempered by the seriousness of the situation. After all, it wasn't just a prank. I genuinely hoped it would be a deterrent. My patience was long gone. I wanted Karen to learn an unforgettable lesson about respecting boundaries, both literal and figurative. The next day, I was off work, waiting for the inevitable. I knew from prior experience that Karen usually did her snooping early in the morning or late in the afternoon, probably hoping to avoid me. By noon, there was no sign of her. By evening, I grew anxious and worried my plan might not spring into action. Around 8 o'clock, I decided to call a night. Then, around dinner time the following day, I peeked out my window to see Karen's short figure marching down the sidewalk, notebook and phone in hand. She paused at my mailbox, glared at it like she had a personal vendetta, and then angled toward my yard. My heart began to race. I nearly considered sprinting outside to stop her from crossing that invisible line, but I resisted. This was precisely what I'd set up for. I watched from my back window, the perfect vantage point. She approached the fence, started muttering to herself, and fiddled with something in her pocket. Then she squinted at my shrubs. She took a step onto my property, exactly the patch of grass in range of the motion sensor. My device was roughly 15 feet away, hidden behind a large, fake rock the kind people sometimes use to cover a sprinkler valve. My mind ran wild in that split second. Would the mechanism fire as planned? Was the angle correct? Was there enough pressure? 1,000 doubts whirled through my head. She took another step. Then I saw the device trigger, a tiny puff of mist, barely noticeable to the naked eye, rise up in a small cloud around her ankles. Karen, of course, didn't notice. She was too busy scribbling in her notebook, probably writing about how my shrubs were precisely 2 centimeters too tall. I bit my lip, practically shaking with anticipation. The moment of truth arrived when she scrunched her nose in confusion, as though she'd just stepped in something rotten. She glanced down, sniffing the air more forcefully. That's when I saw the alarm spread across her face. She staggered backward, her hands swatting at the air as though trying to push the odor away. She looked at the bottom of her sneakers, perhaps thinking she'd stepped in dog waste. But dog waste had nothing on the stench. As a breeze kicked up, the smell probably hit her full force, and her expression contorted in disgust, turning her cheeks a mottled red. She let out a strangled sound, something between a gag and a squeal. Then, for the first time in memory, Karen didn't fight or argue. She fled. She actually sprinted down the sidewalk, arms flapping, as though outrunning the odor. I watched her retreat with a mix of satisfaction and glee. I'd done it. I'd turned my yard into a fortress of reeking consequence for trespassers. But would that truly be the end of it? Or was this just the beginning of a new, smellier chapter in our conflict? The fallout began almost immediately. Word spread through the neighborhood that Karen had been assaulted by a foul odor, and rumors flew like bees around a hive. Nobody knew precisely what had happened, only that Karen was furious and out for blood. She'd stormed home, presumably reeking, and had no luck scrubbing the stench from her shoes. I even heard from another neighbor that Karen had to toss them out entirely. In a perverse way, I felt a sense of accomplishment. She had trespassed, triggered my booby-trap, and got what she deserved. But I also felt a twinge of unease. People like Karen never give up that easily. Sure enough, the next day, I found a letter in my mailbox, an official notice on HOA letterhead, stamped with the board seal. It accused me of installing an unapproved mechanical device on my property, one that posed a threat to neighborhood harmony. It demanded I remove it immediately or face possible fines. I laughed, reading it aloud to my buddy over the phone. He nearly fell over from chuckling. Of course, the HOA had no real authority to mandate how I protected my own yard from trespassers. The bigger issue, though, was that they'd started formal proceedings against me. Karen didn't just stop at official letters. She circulated a petition among neighbors, claiming I was a public menace. She told them tall tales about how my yard was a danger zone where kids or pets could be harmed. That was particularly galling because I designed the contraption to target only intruders who stepped beyond the fence line, adult intruders specifically. Kids who were playing harmlessly in the street wouldn't trigger anything, nor would any well-behaved dog walker who stayed on the sidewalk. The day after the letter arrived, I got a knock on my door from my neighbor, Ms. Dyson, an older woman in her 70s who liked to keep to herself. She asked me, quite politely, what was going on with Karen's accusations. I explained how Karen had consistently trespassed, how I tried every diplomatic approach, and how I'd finally installed a harmless deterrent. Ms. Dyson just sighed and said, I never liked her anyway, then offered me a plate of cookies to show her support. I was grateful someone understood, but not everyone was on my side. A few neighbors, especially those who believed the HOA could do no wrong, started eyeing me suspiciously. At the grocery store, I spotted Linda, who was friendly with Karen. She made a point of turning her cart abruptly and racing off to another aisle, as if I was radioactive. The tension grew by the hour. One afternoon, as I was pruning my hydrangeas, Karen marched right up to my fence. This time, she didn't trespass. She stood on the sidewalk, phone raised as though she were filming some scandalous livestream. You think this is funny? She demanded, in a shrill voice that carried over the hum of a passing car. I've contacted the authorities, and they're going to make you take that contraption down. You'll be lucky if you don't get arrested. I forced a polite smile. Arrested for what? You walked onto my property, past a private sign, and triggered a defensive measure that's non-toxic and only active within my fenced area. Her eyes bulged. Non-toxic? It ruined my shoes, my jeans, my entire closet stinks of it. Not my problem, I replied, turning my back to continue pruning. She kept ranting from the sidewalk, demanding I remove it, threatening new fines, even hinting that she'd file a lawsuit. But I knew the law. My lawyer friend had told me, as long as it's not designed to inflict serious harm, and there are posted signs, you're probably fine. Just be prepared for a headache. I was more than prepared, though. Frankly, I'd had enough of Karen's harassment, and if it took a protracted battle to keep her away, I was willing to fight. What I didn't anticipate was her cunning. A few nights later, I woke up to a strange smell in my house, something acrid and chemical. I scrambled out of bed, heart pounding, wondering if my skunk device had malfunctioned. But as I stepped onto my porch, I saw streaks of some foul liquid splashed across the siding. It smelled like rancid vinegar and burnt plastic mixed together. A wave of panic and anger swept over me. Someone had vandalized my home. I checked my security footage, and sure enough, there was a figure in a hood sneaking up to the house, flinging a bottle of that noxious substance. The resolution was poor, but I could guess who might do such a thing. That was a new low, complete payback for the skunk fiasco. I called the non-emergency police line and filed a report. The officer who arrived was polite but non-committal about next steps. "We'll do what we can," he said, glancing at the footage. "Hard to identify them, but if you suspect your neighbor, maybe you can get a restraining order." A restraining order for an entire HOA official? "That'll go over well," I said, sighing. It felt like I was at war in my own neighborhood. Karen had escalated beyond petty trespass. She was actively seeking revenge. But I refused to back down. If she wanted a fight, she'd get one. Yet I had to be strategic. I knew the ultimate solution might involve a combination of legal steps and more creative deterrents. In the meantime, I spent my days cleaning up the mess on my siding, rechecking my motion sensors, and dealing with incessant HOA notices about everything from my unauthorized yard device to my fence posts not matching the approved color scheme. Clearly, Karen was pulling every string possible. Some nights, I'd lie awake, half smiling at the memory of Karen fleeing my yard, but also feeling an undercurrent of tension. Could the next retaliation be worse? Would she set me up, call the police claiming I'd assaulted her? Or would my neighbors eventually side with me, seeing Karen for the troublemaker she truly was? I decided to wait it out carefully. Sometimes, the best revenge is patience, letting your adversary dig themselves into a hole. But I had no idea how deep Karen's trenches went or whether she was planning something even more extreme. A few days after the vandalism, I got a call from a local newspaper reporter. Apparently, Karen had reached out to them with a sensational story about a dangerous booby-trap in a suburban neighborhood. My first instinct was to hang up, but then I realized that if I refused to speak, the story would be one-sided, painting me as some unhinged homeowner terrorizing the community. So I invited the reporter over, but only on the condition they see the sign on my fence and witness the device in a controlled demonstration. I made sure we both stood a safe distance away. To my relief, the demonstration was uneventful, a motion sensor that triggered a small puff of odor. The reporter wrinkled their nose slightly when I explained it was skunk essence, but otherwise, they seemed more amused than horrified. They asked questions about Karen's trespassing, my attempts at peaceful resolution, and the escalation. I tried to keep my answers calm and factual. This was my chance to convey that I was just trying to protect my property from an overzealous HOA official who ignored repeated requests to stay out. The reporter nodded thoughtfully, scribbling notes. When the article came out a week later, the headline read, "Homeowner's skunk stink defense sparks controversy in quiet suburb." Not exactly flattering, but also wasn't the hit piece Karen might have wanted. It mentioned my posted signs and my claim that this was a last resort after months of harassment. The article quoted Karen, who insisted I was unstable and a public menace, but also quoted Ms. Dyson, who described me as a polite neighbor who just wanted privacy. Public sentiment started shifting, or at least becoming more divided. Some folks sympathized with my right to defend my property, while others stood by Karen, believing an HOA official must have a good reason for checking yards. However, once the story hit, the broader community outside our neighborhood began to weigh in on social media. People from neighboring towns left comments like, "Good for him, that Karen had it coming," and "HOA horror stories are the worst." Amid all this, Karen tried doubling down. She posted flyers around the block, urging people to sign a complaint demanding my contraption be dismantled. But the intimidation factor started to wear off. Neighbors who were once silent began to speak up, sharing stories of Karen's intrusive visits and questionable tactics. One neighbor told me in private that Karen had threatened to report their vintage mailbox for being 2 inches too tall just because they didn't sign her petition. Knowing Karen was losing ground in the court of public opinion didn't solve everything, though. I still had to deal with the official processes. The HOA board was set to meet in a couple of weeks, and Karen had placed my skunk device issue at the top of the agenda. Rumor was she wanted them to pass a new bylaw forbidding chemical deterrents of any kind. I prepared a stack of documents, local ordinances about trespassing, property rights, and permissible home security measures. I also had photos showing my posted signs and the device's location. My lawyer friend assured me that if push came to shove, the HOA's internal rules couldn't override state property laws. But I knew HOAs could make life miserable if they chose. Fines, liens, and bureaucratic red tape were all within their arsenal. On the night of the board meeting, I arrived early, wearing my best let's be reasonable outfit, a simple collared shirt and slacks. My heart was pounding, though I kept my expression neutral. Neighbors trickled into the small conference room, which smelled of stale coffee and musty carpet. The board members sat behind a long table, expressions stony. Karen stood off to the side, arms folded, glaring at me like a hawk. After some routine business, approval of last month's minutes, a few landscaping updates, we reached the main event. Karen stood and began her spiel, describing my device in hyperbolic terms, an aggressive chemical weapon that endangered the community's well-being. She rattled off a list of alleged victims, though she only mentioned herself by name. When it was my turn to respond, I took a deep breath. I carefully explained my perspective, how I tried politeness, posted signs, even legal notices, yet Karen persisted in trespassing. I recounted the vandalism to my property, though I didn't directly accuse Karen of it, implying only that it occurred suspiciously soon after the skunk incident. I stressed that the device was well within my fenced area, harmless unless someone trespassed, and posted with clear warnings. The room buzzed with quiet conversations. A couple of board members looked uneasy, possibly because they knew Karen's abrasive style all too well. Others seemed skeptical. After I finished, the board asked a few questions. Why not use a fence extension? Why not call the police each time you see her trespassing? I answered politely, I do have a fence and I have called the police, but they can only do so much if there's no immediate threat. I pointed out that a fence extension wouldn't stop Karen's brand of bold intrusion. Karen stood again, jabbing a finger at me. He's placing the entire neighborhood at risk. This is pure vigilantism. I bit my tongue to keep from laughing out loud at the idea that a harmless skunk spray device was pure vigilantism. Then a voice from the back spoke up. It was Ms. Dyson. Her frail figure stood, cane in hand, but her voice was surprisingly firm. Karen, dear, if you hadn't been creeping around his yard like a prowler, you wouldn't have been sprayed. So maybe you should learn to mind your business. A ripple of chuckles passed through the audience. Karen's face went crimson. She started sputtering, but the board chair intervened, banging a small gavel to restore order. In the heated atmosphere of the board meeting, the chair announced they'd table the matter until after consulting with their legal counsel. That meant I had a temporary reprieve, no immediate ruling forcing me to dismantle my skunk deterrent. Karen stormed out, probably outraged that she hadn't received her expected rubber stamp. Over the next few days, life resumed its uneasy rhythm. I continued with yard work, neighborly chats with Ms. Dyson, and the occasional wave at folks passing by. But I kept a vigilant eye on my camera feeds and made sure my booby trap was well maintained. Karen was laying low, which made me suspect she was scheming. Sure enough, about a week later, a stern-faced man from the county sheriff's office arrived at my doorstep. He informed me that Karen had filed a complaint accusing me of assault by chemical means. I try not to roll my eyes. The deputy was polite, but it was obvious the complaint was built on shaky ground. Karen was forced to admit that she stepped onto my property uninvited. I provided the deputy with my recorded footage of her trespassing. He watched it, saw the posted signs, and raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a creative setup," he said, trying not to smirk. "But Karen's claiming you intentionally set it up just for her." "I set it up for any trespasser," I clarified. "She's the only one who keeps trespassing." He asked a few more questions, took some notes, and then politely left, saying he'd be in touch if anything further came up. That was the last I heard about the assault complaint, so either it didn't go anywhere or Karen was told by the authorities it was a lost cause. The final showdown arrived 2 weeks later, when the HOA board reconvened. This time, they sent a memo to all residents, urging them to attend the special session. The rumor mill suggested they drafted an official rule banning chemical deterrents, and they wanted the community's input before voting. I arrived at the small community hall to find it packed with neighbors, more than I'd ever seen at an HOA meeting. Some wore bemused smiles, while others had stern looks that hinted they might side with Karen. I took a seat near the front, with Ms. Dyson beside me, gently patting my arm in moral support. Karen sat with the board members, flipping through papers. The meeting started with a dull list of updates, budget, road repairs, tree trimming, and then launched into the real issue. One board member cleared his throat and read off the proposed rule. Homeowners shall not install or maintain any device that emits chemical sprays, noxious odors, or other similar substances intended to deter entry onto private property, if such device poses a nuisance or health risk to neighbors. A hush fell over the room. The wording was obviously aimed at me. Yet the phrase, "if such device poses a nuisance or health risk," was vague. Did Skunk's spray count as a health risk? It was foul, sure, but not toxic. Karen leaned into her microphone, wearing a triumphant smirk. "As you can see, this measure is meant to preserve the safety and well-being of our community. We can't have vigilantes punishing neighbors with vile sprays." I stood up, requesting to speak. The chair nodded. "Go ahead." Taking a deep breath, I addressed the crowd. "I understand we all want a peaceful neighborhood, but we also want property rights and privacy. This device was never aimed at unsuspecting passersby. It was placed in a clearly marked, fenced area. If someone trespasses, well, I think that's on them, not on me." A man in the back, Dave, an ex-military fellow, raised his hand. "So let's get real. We have a bigger issue with trespassing than we do with the deterrent. Karen, you've been known to barge onto people's lawns for inspections. That's not official HOA policy, is it?" Karen bristled. "We have a right to ensure compliance, but not to enter private property without permission." Dave cut her off. "At least not in any bylaw I've read." A low murmur rippled through the audience. The board members exchanged uncertain glances. Karen tried to regain control, flipping through her thick binder of HOA rules. I seized the moment. "I'm willing to consider removing the device if the HOA formally agrees that no board member or representative will enter my property without explicit permission, except in emergencies." The chair frowned. "That would be a new policy." "I'll second it," Dave called out. Karen's mouth hung open. She sputtered a response. "This is outrageous. We can't just let people break the rules." Ms. Dyson piped up in her calm but firm voice. "Rules are one thing. Trespassing is another. Perhaps there's a middle ground here." What followed was a flurry of back-and-forth debate. Neighbors recounted their own issues with the HOA's overreach. Karen tried to pivot the conversation, insisting that my device was the real problem. But the tide was turning. People were tired of being harassed over petty infractions, and the skunk spray story had drawn widespread attention, revealing just how far the HOA, or at least Karen, would go. Eventually, the board chair called for a compromise. The new bylaw would pass with specific language stating that any such defensive measures must have posted warnings. In return, the HOA would clarify that no board member could enter a homeowner's property without permission or a safety emergency. We hammered out the details over another hour, with Karen fuming silently, arms crossed. When the final vote took place, the revised bylaw passed. I agreed to keep my warning signs visible and maintain the device in a way that wouldn't affect passing pedestrians or visitors. Karen's hopes of outright banning my contraption were effectively dashed. As the meeting ended, neighbors came up to me, some shaking my hand and others patting my shoulder in sympathy. Ms. Dyson gave me a wry smile. Never a dull moment in this place. Karen stormed out without a word. I half expected more retaliation, but over the following weeks, things settled into a tentative peace. She no longer prowled around my hydrangeas, and I didn't have to set off the skunk trap again. It remained primed, though, a lingering reminder of just how far I'd been pushed. Sometimes, as I sit on my porch sipping iced tea, I still catch a glimpse of Karen walking by on the sidewalk, nose in the air, as though she can still smell that faint reek of justice wafting around her memories. But she doesn't stop or trespass anymore. And that, in my book, is a victory worth savoring, pun very much intended. The end.